Open your Bibles to the book of Hebrews, chapter number 12 today. Hard to believe we only have 2 weeks left in the book of Hebrews. As we were singing this morning, Roy, I don't know if you looked at, I have a document that Roy has access to and a couple of others that have all my preaching calendar on there. I don't know if you read through this chapter in preparation for today. I'm planning the song list or whatever, but man, the songs couldn't have been much more accurate. It's almost like someone planned it, whether it was Roy or someone a little bit above him. But Hebrews chapter number 12 today, I just want to jump right into the message. We'll have a few announcements at the end of the service. But as we jump into Hebrews chapter number 12, Joe, I got a little bit of a ring up here. As we jump into Hebrews chapter number 12, one of the things that we see at the very beginning that is really obvious as we begin to jump into this passage is the pull to quit. Anyone in here ever felt like quitting? There's in the media, you'll read about a trend. They're calling it a trend. I don't know if it's a trend or it's something that's always existed, and we just now have a name for it, called quiet quitting. Where people are afraid that they don't have another job to go to, but they don't want to do well at the job that they're at anymore, and so they just come in and punch the clock, do the bare minimum. Like I said, I think it's something that's always existed. There's just a name for it now. I remember back in high school, I played sports in high school, and I know I don't look like it as much anymore, but it's okay. You just have to take my word for it. I played soccer, I played basketball, and I love both of them, still try to play them when I can. One of the things I hated about organized sports was I hated the running during practice. I was fine with the running in the game, but the running to practice just wore on me. My first year playing soccer at the varsity level, the team had a new coach, and this coach, he came in day one and he said, we are going to run harder than any team in our division. My eyes got about this big. I said, excuse me? He said, we're going to win games and we're going to run harder than any team in our division. And so we did. We ran and we ran and we ran. We started at the beginning of the season. We would run laps around the soccer field. If you're a runner, that's about 400 meters is what that kind of equates to. We would do laps around the soccer field. And then as the season progressed, we got a little further into our conditioning. Laps around the soccer field were not enough. And so he created what we called property laps, which if you can't figure out what those are, they are laps around the school's property, which each lap now is equal to about half to 3/4 of a mile. And so he'd say, all right, guys, property laps, go. And in my mind, not liking to be the one just running just to run and to practice, I didn't like that part of it. I always wanted to ask, how many? If you ever played sports, asking your coach how many is a bad idea. He will tell you or she will tell you when it's time for you to know. And I remember the first practice, there's the one kid on the team always, right, that has to ask all of the questions. And so he said, all right, property laps, go. And he said, how many, coach? And his response, like any good coach, more now. And so we take off running. We're all glaring at the kid who just can't keep his thoughts to himself, and we're just running and running. And I remember as we got into the second and third lap, just running for the sake of running, it felt like, began to look at different things in the horizon and say, okay, if I can just make it past that tree, if I can just make it past that driveway, if I can just make it past, and my eyes kept going to that next thing just to make it past. And then my heart leapt when I saw the upperclassmen that were in front of me get called in to stop. Oh, we're almost done. I would weep tears of joy, or tears of something else. I'm not really sure. But we would come in and you would see it in the distance. You would see some of the faster runners get pulled in, and then, okay, it's going to be my turn. And finally you hear the coach say, all right, come on in, get some water. Thank you, Lord. I never understood falling down and kissing the ground until I was told I could stop running, okay? I was all about not running. When we look at Hebrews chapter number 12, as we get into this topic, you say, okay, interesting illustration, interesting point you have here, but watch what goes on in this. Sometimes as you're running, Oftentimes, in fact, for me, a thought would come into my head. It would be easier to walk. It would be easier to stop running, right? It would be easier when your stomach and your abs are just tearing you up from having gone miles and miles, when your legs are jello and they're on fire, when you're sweating bullets in the 90-degree plus humidity, whatever. You're just ready. It would be easier to stop, wouldn't it? As we come to Hebrews chapter number 12, we're meeting men and women, really all through the book of Hebrews. We see this is being written to men and women who in their lives, it would have been easier to quit. It would have been easier to quit. As the book of Hebrews is being written, if we go all the way back to chapter 1 in our introduction to the book, most believe that this book was written in the 60s after Jesus Christ. So 60 to 65, the first century, so 0065. So we're talking almost 2,000 years ago. And during that time, the emperor of Rome was a man by the name of Nero. If you've heard of Nero before, if you're familiar at all with his reign, about AD 64, the city of Rome caught on fire, began to burn. Many people today believe that Nero, in fact, had this fire started, that he caused this as a way to bring some panic into the city, as a way to kind of tighten his grip on the people of Rome. And after the fact, Nero went on to tell the people of Rome that the Christians were the ones who started the fire, and began to persecute heavily the Christians throughout the Roman Empire. And so this book is being written right around the time frame, maybe a little bit before these events, maybe a little bit after these events, but right around the time that there was severe persecution that either was coming or would be coming in the lives of these hearers. Even if it was on the other end of this timetable, let's say it was after Nero's reign, there were some times that Christians had a little bit easier than under his reign. But then just even a decade later, an emperor by the name of Domitian came into power in the year 81. And he was known as being one of the most fervent persecutors of Christians in the Roman Empire. And so for the next decade and a half during his rule, Christians once again were driven out of their homes, were put on trial, were exiled as a result of their faith. So as the book of Hebrews is being written, it's being written to people who had experienced difficult times and would experience difficult times again. In chapter number 11, last week we took the time and we walked through a number of those that we would call heroes of the faith. And we saw that they could be strong in their faith because God was worthy of that faith. He was faithful through everything. And so we watched as that took place, as these individuals were faithful to God and had faith in him, and as God was faithful to them, and he never broke his promise. He kept them, every one. And then we enter into chapter number 12. We have to remind ourselves that we have those days that we feel like making the easy decision. Anyone just get up and you feel like making all the easy decisions that day? You don't feel like sticking to the diet. You don't feel like exercising. You don't feel like cleaning the house. You don't feel like going to work. You don't feel like dealing with the kids. You don't feel like, we've all been there, right? We don't feel like fill in the blank. We don't feel like it. Well, the fact is that when it comes to our Christian life, it can be very easy to not feel like it too. But that's not what God has called us to. Look at Hebrews chapter 12. Begin with me in verse number 1. Therefore, that word therefore just meaning, hey, go back and look because of the reasons I have already told you. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And so right out of the gate in this chapter, the author, he begins to immediately apply the things that he just told us about. And what does he say? He says this: let's run. Let's run. Let's go. Very first thing he says is, look, guys, we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. How many of you enjoy going to live sporting events? You enjoy just the buzz of the crowd? Awesome. I love it. I love it. Yesterday I spent way too much time watching football. Anybody else? A couple of us in here, all right? We spent way too much time watching football. I love watching college football, especially when it kicks off. It's so cool to see those crowds coming together. I try once a year, I try to make a Michigan game at Michigan Stadium. And the reason why is it's electric. If you like sports and you like being around other people who like sports, you can huddle together with 100,000 of your closest friends, and you guys can all scream and cheer for your team. It's an awesome experience if you like sports. What he's painting here is similar. He's saying, hey guys, as we are going into our Christian life, we can look around and we can see the people in the crowd who have gone on before us. What is that crowd of witnesses? It's those ones who have already passed on before. So he's going back to this chapter and he says, hey guys, you look out into the crowd, you see Abraham saying, come on, man, it's worth it. It's cool to see oftentimes alumni at college games, and they're cheering on these kids that they had played with for a couple of years, or these others that are coming on behind them in this tradition. It's fun to watch, but as we live our lives, we get the opportunity to look and say, hey, there's Joseph and Jacob. Hey, there's Moses. There's Sarah. There's all of these men and women, David, and even for us today, the apostles that have gone on before us, witnessing the way that the gospel is moving in our culture and in our community today. We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. As they're looking on, they're saying, continue the race that we ran. And so we have this privilege, but at the same time, this responsibility to continue a faith that has been passed down from generation to generation, and to continue across the finish line that's been set in front of us. But not only that, watch what he says as he continues. He says, as we run, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely. As we look at this phrase, we see two different obstacles that are going to hinder our race. We see weights and we see sin. Some interpreters believe, there's a little bit of a debate. Some interpreters believe that these are the same thing, that he's talking about sins as weights. I think these are actually two separate things. And here's what I mean. Is a weight by itself is not necessarily a bad thing, is it? But a weight, when you begin to race, is a negative. So if you were to go out and to train, you may even run with weights. You may put on ankle weights or a weight vest, and you may go train with weights. When race day comes, you know what you're not doing? Putting on the weight vest. You don't see Usain Bolt, the fastest man probably to ever live, going to the start line of the 100-meter dash and saying, oh, hold on, guys, I forgot my ankle weights. Let me strap on some 20-pounders. No. Why? Because it's going to slow him down. You know what else? As we look at a race, there are a lot of things that are essential to a good race. Very high on the list is hydration. If you watch marathon running ever, if you ever attend a marathon or a half marathon even, stationed throughout the run, there are places where the participants can grab a cup of water. You know what I've never seen at a marathon? I've never seen someone bring their own Gatorade container. I've never seen someone pull up to the line with a little red wagon and a Gatorade cooler. Could you imagine if you were to go to a race and someone's all dressed out and they have the gear that's all nice and tight, wind resistant, and they have the shoes laced up just right, and they're all decked out. They're ready to race. They're ready to go, and they trot up to the start line, pulling the water behind them. What would you say to that individual? Are they going to finish the race? Are they going to get as far as they could have? Are they going to do it in the time that they could have done? Now, if you ask them, what would they, you say, hey, listen, why are you doing that? They might say, you got to stay hydrated when you're running this race. Is that true or false? Well, that's true. But you see, what that water has become, while it's a necessity, that water has become baggage, a weight that is dragging down the participants. In our lives, we have needs. Can we all say yes? We have needs. Physical, emotional, relational, spiritual, financial. We have needs. But are the needs in your life for the purpose of helping you continue with this race, or are they weighing you down? So often, if we're not careful, we can allow things that are good things to become God things, and they do not help us to finish this race. We can say, oh, but look at this thing, this relationship, this job, this money, this whatever it may be in your life. And you say, but I love this thing. And it's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not sinful. But maybe that thing is keeping you from being able to run the race that God has called you to. Maybe that thing is preventing you from doing the work that God has called you to. Maybe it's a habit in your life, and that habit is hurting your relationship with your family. That habit, you say, well, what's wrong with it? There's nothing in the Bible that says I can't do that. Well, listen, what's the fruit of it? What's it doing in you? What's it doing to you? Is it drawing you closer to that finish line and towards Christ, or is it pulling you back and pulling you away from the things that God has called you to? So there are weights that can surround us, and then there's a sin that's constantly clinging to us. One word that's translated into the English here, in some versions, it's beset, which means this: surrounded by. Sin surrounds us. In fact, sin's inside of us. It's every which way that we can go. And that sin is going to poison you, it's going to choke you out, and it's going to keep you from being able to finish this race. And so we have both the weights that are good things that become God things, or we become too dependent on, and we have the sin that we'll get to in a minute, because the author is going to expound on that a little bit more. And so there are obstacles in the middle of this race. But even in the midst of this, watch what he says. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. And so we see in the middle of all of this, we also have the goal. We also have the goal. What's the goal in the Christian life? Jesus. Jesus. How do we know we've reached the end? When you see him, you can stop. But understand this with me. Following Jesus, it's a marathon. It is not a sprint. Following Jesus is a marathon, not a sprint. So often we can begin fast, or we can go through a season of our life and be like, I'm on fire. Watch oh man, look, if only everyone could keep up with me. But you know what happens oftentimes in a race, especially a race among inexperienced runners, or even if you watch the Olympics and watch some of the longer races, if you watch a lengthy race, 2,000 meters or more, very rarely is the person that leads at the end of the first lap going to win the race. Very, very rarely. Why? Because they just burn themselves out to get their 15 minutes of fame. They said, I want to lead. I want people to know my name, and I'm not going to win, but it doesn't matter. Watch me go. And so they get out in front and get everyone all excited and hyped up, and the announcers are saying, oh, there's so-and-so. They're leading in the pack. And then when lap 3 and lap 4 come around, and when lap 5 comes around for the 2,000, what do you see? You see they begin creeping towards the back of the pack, because everyone who had paced themselves now is the reserves to make the final push. The Christian life, it's not a sprint. You can't just get up and say, boom, watch me go. I'm going to do it for 6 weeks or 6 months, and then I'm going to be done. That's not how the Christian life works. The race is still going whether you're running or not. okay? We don't just opt out and say, okay, time out, I'm done, I'm getting off. The race is still going. And so what we see here is he's preparing us for a lifetime of following Jesus. How do we do that? Watch verse number 3. Consider him. This is the goal, Jesus. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. And so if the goal of our faith is Jesus, and Jesus endured hardships, are we going to endure hardships? Well, duh. Yeah, it's going to be difficult. There will be difficult days. But we cannot grow weary or faint-hearted in your struggle against sin. What does he say? You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. And so here in the middle of this, he says, you haven't resisted to the shedding of blood. What does he mean? Your life is still going on. You haven't fought to the point of death yet. If I can give the Pastor Nate version paraphrase of this passage, there's still breath in your lungs. That means the race is still going. Is there going to be a day when we resist to the shedding of blood? There will be a day that many of these who are reading it would literally resist till the shedding of blood. They would die. They would give their life for their faith. It was coming. But he's saying, hey, you're not there yet. And for you and I, if you are in this room today, you're alive. I think. I hope. That means the race isn't over. That means your race isn't done. Now, surely we have children in this room, and we have some who are a little bit more seasoned, time-honored. Are we all at the same spot in our races? No. No, it would be ridiculous to assume that. But we're all still running. And so what we see is he says, hey, listen, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding of blood. You still have life, so don't get weary. Don't get faint-hearted. Don't you remember what was said before? And he goes back again. He quotes the Old Testament. He says, God says, and what does he say? He says, don't regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Because why? The Lord disciplines the one he loves. I was speaking with a member of our church this morning before the service, and we were talking about some things that he has gone through over the last several years of his life. And you know what he said to me? I thought this was so mature and such a wonderful perspective. He said, listen, God grows you through the hard times. God grows you through the hard times. Do you know why my coach wanted us to run these miles that to me as a teenager felt senseless? Because he wanted us to be able to do that in a game. He wanted us to be able to go on the field and have the endurance to continue to play until the whistle blew. Well, for you and for me, understand this. We have to have endurance following Jesus because we're in the middle of a marathon. We're in the middle of a marathon. And so it's not enough just to get up and to sprint and to go and to look fast, but we have to discipline ourselves in the middle of all of this. And if we are regardless of whether we are willing to discipline ourselves or not, you know what God's going to do as our loving Heavenly Father? He is going to discipline us. Does he discipline us out of hatred or disappointment? No, that's not what the word discipline means. Discipline means to make a disciple of, to help to become a follower of, to train, to mold. That's what discipline is. When a parent disciplines their child, they are molding that child to who they ought to be. And so is the Lord with us. As a loving father, he disciplines because we are not yet what he has called us to be. So if you want to say, if you get to the point in your life that you have achieved perfection, that will be the moment that you no longer need the discipline of the Lord. Is that going to happen in this lifetime? No. No. And so we continue in this race. And watch what he says here, because he presses into this sin that we mentioned earlier. Watch this. It's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, he says in verse 7. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. So watch this. He says, if God's not testing you, you're not his child. Do you know who I don't discipline? Anyone else's kids. Okay? I mean, your kid's throwing a fit in the lobby or whatever, I'm going to let you take care of it. Kids are kids. I'm not sitting here judging you. It happens. My kids are throwing a fit in the lobby. Now I have a problem. I am disciplining them. We're having the talk. They're coming to Jesus. Whatever you want to call it, it's happening. Right? So if God is not chastening you, or if he is not letting you endure those hard times, the question we ought to ask ourselves is God trying to grow me? Am I his child? Now watch what he says as he continues. He says, besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. I've never heard someone say, I respect my father so much that gave me everything I wanted and never told me no. I've never heard someone say that. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and lived? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good. Why? Why does God discipline us? That we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. No one likes being disciplined, right? No one enjoys that. It feels heavy. It feels like a weight. But later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And so we have this endurance that comes through discipline. But watch where he goes with this. Because of that, therefore, lift up your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. And so we see once again this running metaphor. He says, prepare the track, prepare the place that you're going, know where you're stepping. Strive for peace with everyone and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. And so what we see in this passage is we're about to see two specific sinful behaviors that he thinks it's necessary for the hearers to be aware of. The first of those he calls a root of bitterness. A root of bitterness. So when the hard times come in your life, where do we begin to look? What do we begin to do? So often, human nature is we begin to pass blame somewhere. We begin to say, well, that person, man, they just really offended me. They hurt me. And can you believe that? Can I tell you this? There's nothing that happened in your life that God did not allow into it. Did you catch that? There is nothing that has happened in your life that God did not allow into it. You want to be mad at that person? Hey, listen, you know who allowed that person to hurt you and to behave that way? God did. This isn't a fun, warm, and fuzzy thing to talk about, is it? Because when we get hurt, what do we want to do? I want to hurt them back. I want to get angry. But what does he say about bitterness? He doesn't say, don't let bitterness grow up within you. What does he say? He says, beware the root of bitterness. Because understand, once bitterness begins to grow, it's a lot more difficult to pluck out. Maybe if you're like me, there are portions of your yard that you don't spend as much time in. There are portions of your yard that aren't as immaculate as others. Sometimes these weeds can grow up. And if you catch those weeds early on when they're just beginning to sprout, you can just take your hands and you can put them in the dirt and you can just pluck that weed right up. But all of a sudden, a month or 2 months has gone by and you haven't noticed this weed, and then you see it and you're like, how in the world did I not notice this weed? And what do you have to do? If you want to get rid of that weed, man, you're going to get the shovel, you're getting the chainsaw, you're getting all kinds of things, because this thing has taken root and it's grown up, and it's like surgery to get this thing out. So we don't need to just be looking for the bitterness when it's obvious and when it's big and when it's painful and it's dominating our lives. We need to understand that bitterness begins small and grows from there. And if we're unwilling to pluck that little root of bitterness, if we look at that bitterness, and if you're like my kids, they're like, oh, look, a little plant. And you're like, no, that's a weed. That's not good for anything. Oh, but look, we have to have it. Oh, I want to take care of my little weed. No, you got to pluck it out, or it's going to grow to the point that removal is going to feel nearly impossible. The root of bitterness within the lives of any individuals, it's damaging. It's damaging. I've heard it compared to an acid that doesn't just erode the things on the outside, it erodes the container that's holding it. It begins to corrupt it from the inside out. But here's what also we see when it comes to bitterness in the lives of a Christian. God has called you to fruitfulness. And if the root of bitterness is growing in your life, what is it going to do to the seed of the gospel? We go to the book of Matthew and look at the parable of the good seed. There was a type of seed. There was one seed that was sown onto thorny ground where the weeds, they grew up. And what happened to the good seed in the middle of all of the thorny bushes and plants? It was choked up. There were only so many nutrients to go around. And so the bad seed, the weeds, took out the seed that was trying to bear fruit. Did you know weeds grow in a lot easier climate than fruit? Were you aware of that? It's a lot easier to grow weeds than it is to grow fruit. And in our lives, it's the same way. You want to reap a harvest of weeds? It's not difficult to do. But you want to bear fruit? We have to beware of the things that are growing up in our lives. And one of the most dangerous of those we see is the root of bitterness. Not only that, and I believe that as the author, as he targets these things, I think these are things that were pervasive in the church of his day, and I believe these are things that are pervasive in the church of our day. Watch what he says next. So not only the root of bitterness, but watch in verse number 16, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. So a little bit of a difficult passage going on here. If you are familiar with the story of Esau, here's what happens when this is taking place. Here's what the picture is that he's referencing. Esau was the brother of Jacob. So you have Abraham, the father of Israel, if you will. He was promised this great nation. He was going to have a child. He was old, and Hebrews 11 actually calls him nearly dead, which is a great thing that you would want to be called in the Bible. And so from there, he has a son named Isaac, the child of promise. Isaac and his wife have two sons that are mentioned specifically, twins, Jacob and Esau. But interestingly, God says, hey, this blessing is going to go to the younger son, Jacob, not the older son, Esau, whereas the birthright was always one that was passed down through the oldest. So Esau was a hunter, and one day he goes out to hunt. Jacob was kind of known as being one that was more likely to stay around the home. He was closer with his mother. He kind of did a lot of those things with her in the culture of the day, the way that kind of worked out. And so one day Esau comes back in from hunting. Esau's thing, not Jacob's thing. Esau comes back in from hunting, and Esau is a little bit of a diva. And he comes in, he says, oh my goodness, I am so hungry I could die. And he sees Jacob, oh, you've been making lunch. Give me some of that. And Jacob says, no, get your own, and like a good brother would. And Esau says, but I want that. And so Jacob says, you know what? I'll give it to you for your birthright. And Esau says, what good's my birthright if I'm dead? And he takes and exchanges this food for his birthright, the blessing that would come through his father, Isaac. And so he makes this exchange with Jacob. He goes, he eats, he has his belly full. But how long is his belly full for? Hours, maybe. And then what happens years down the road? The time comes for the blessing. And who is the blessing given to? Through trickery and treachery, crazy story. But the blessing goes to Jacob, not to Esau. Now, where in that story is sexual immorality? Kind of curious, isn't it? He says, avoid sexual immorality just like Esau. But we never read about Esau practicing sexual immorality. So what is he talking about? You ready? He's talking about trading a permanent blessing for temporary satisfaction. He's talking about trading a permanent blessing for temporary satisfaction. So what is he comparing? This is what's going on. He's saying, listen, you fed yourself because you were hungry and you couldn't control your urges, and so you gave up your future for that thing right now. And then to the first century Christians, he writes, hey, that's immorality. That's what that is. So you and I, as believers in the 21st century, we ought to understand that this is applying to those things in our lives that are come and gone and actually pay us no long-term benefit. Because a single meal will not make you happy. Right? Can we all agree on that? And so when we say, oh, but this just tastes so good. Yeah, you're happy until it's gone. 5-10 minutes. It's it. It's here and whew. Immorality. In our culture today, a lot of avenues for that. We're consumed by this. We are corrupted by this. And once again, like bitterness, the same immorality hollows us out from the inside out. This isn't the sin that has a public face and that we see and we look at someone and say, oh, they're guilty of blank. That's a bitter person or an immoral person. No, but what we see is these are things that corrupt us. They destroy us. They hurt us. And through that, they hurt those around us as well. And so we see that the author here very clearly gives us two examples of things that we ought to, as believers in Jesus Christ, avoid because they will not help you to finish the race that he has called you to. But as we look at all of these things, we understand that there are going to be different people that are likely to fall into these different traps. These are not, you have those that want to look back, and you have those that want to look to the next thing, okay? And all of us are probably going to fit into one of these categories. We're going to look back, and maybe we're more prone to the bitterness side of things. We have a hard time letting go of the things that happened yesterday. And then some of us, we're more pulled to that next thing. And the thing that's happened already, the meal that we just got, the thing that just happened in our lives, it's not enough for us. We've got to go forward. We've got to go forward. We need more. But what we see here in this text is that the gospel not only saves us, I want you to understand this, from the penalty of sin, but it also saves us from the power of sin in our lives. The gospel doesn't just save you and all of a sudden it's a ticket to heaven and you're going to be there, but it actually helps us and gives us the ability to resist sin in this life. It actually changes us from the inside out. And then look at this last paragraph, the last couple paragraphs that we have here. Because the author begins to tell us about the greatness of the kingdom of God. Verse 18, he says, you have not come to what may be touched. A blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, the sounds of a trumpet and a voice. These words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. And this is going back to the times of Moses and the messages that are coming from God that overwhelmed the people with their senses. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you, he says, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in a festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, to the saints of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. And so he says, he's comparing Jesus in this new covenant that we are believing in to the old covenant, the things that had taken place prior to Jesus' death, his burial, and resurrection. He says, listen, they don't compare. Before that, when Moses was giving the law, if we want to think of that as a glorious day, hey, no one approached God during that period of time. Even an animal sets foot on that mountain where it's not supposed to be, they were stoned. The people begged for God and said, okay, God, all right, stop. It's too much for us. We can't endure this. Even Moses, the leader of Israel, said, I'm afraid. Let's take it down a notch, God. And yet today we have the opportunity to go in. Today we are welcomed as sons and as daughters of God, and we have the opportunity to come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God. And it doesn't happen just in a physical sense, but understand this. It happens through what? Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 1. Faith. Through faith. We enter into this promise. We enter into this relationship. We enter into the salvation that is offered. In verse 25, see that you don't refuse him who is speaking. Who's speaking in the book of Hebrews? God is speaking. God is speaking. That's not in doubt. From chapter number 1, God is speaking. So see that you don't refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time, his voice shook the earth, but now he's promised, yet once more, I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. And so what is he speaking of? The things in this life, the weight, the sin that keeps us from running the race. Can I tell you, every piece of that comes with an expiration date. Every item that you and I hold so dear on this earth, it is temporary. The house that you live in. I know there are people in here, you built your house and it's a beautiful home and that's wonderful. There's going to come a day that you will no longer live in that house. And if Jesus does not return in the near future, there's going to be a time where that house doesn't exist anymore. It's going to be torn down. We watch things around us age. They don't last. Relationships. You say, well, my family is the most important thing. And I praise God that your family is valuable to you. It ought to be. But there's going to come a day that you're separated from your family. There's going to come a day that those relationships are not going to be the way that they are now. Because when we take our wedding vows, do you know what we say in those vows? We say, till death do us part, right? And then what happens? That vow's over. It's done. What does it mean? It's temporary. The lives that we hold dear, they're but a vapor. The job that you have, well, how many jobs have we been through anyways, right? You don't meet someone who's had one job their entire life, very, very rarely. So that job that we value and that job that's the most important thing about us, well, hey, that company you work for probably won't exist in the next century, right? Good grief. And yet we're willing to sell ourselves for it. We're willing to pursue the things, the stuff that doesn't last. But watch what he compares it to. He says in verse 27, yet once more, this indicates the removal of things that are shaken, the things that if you were to take it and to rumble it, the things that are going to collapse, fall apart. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So in these verses, I want you to see with me the greatness of the kingdom of God. And if you have placed your faith in Jesus Christ, you are a citizen of a better kingdom. You are a citizen of a better kingdom. You're a citizen of a kingdom that will never fall and that will never fade away. We can look around and we can say, well, our country isn't what it used to be. Sure. Okay, I'm not trying to argue that. I've only been around for a few decades, so I don't know anything as far as that goes. But I can tell you this. Empires rise and fall, don't they? Nations, they come and they go. All of these things in our eyes that feel so permanent, they're temporary. But you and I, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ and your faith has been placed in his death, his burial, and his resurrection, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, forever. There's no shadow of turning in him. There is no difference. It's an unshakable kingdom. And so one day, if your hope is in Jesus Christ alone, you will see the fulfillment of that, and no one can take that away. Do you hear me? No one can take that away. You know what that means for us? Going back to last week, we can be courageous because the object of our faith is unshakable. He doesn't move. He doesn't get caught off guard by the things that you and I can't predict. We can't predict a lot of things. But the fact is that Jesus Christ is the most predictable piece, beautifully predictable and unpredictable thing within our lives. We don't know how he's going to work, but we know he will. And when does he fail? When does he let us down? Does he always do things the way that we want him to? No. And that's a good thing. Because if my kids got their way the whole time, you know what they're eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Candy. But they have a father and a mother who know better than they do, and you have a heavenly Father that knows better than you do, and he's preparing you for something greater. You're a citizen of a better kingdom, which means this: our faith rests in a better king. Our faith rests in a better king. Now, you and I, we like to be our king. We like to be our king, don't we? I like to be the king of my life, and you like to be the king or the queen of yours. But there's a better king, one who knows the beginning from the end, one who understands the things in life that are going to be obstacles, that are going to hurt us, that are going to keep us from fulfilling the work that is before us. There's a better king. And so where is your faith today? Is your faith in you and what you're able to accomplish? Is it in the job that you have, or the significance that you find in your family, or in the things that you have, and the safety of just being able to retreat to your house? And that's my thing. Well, listen, I don't want to be morbid, but I want to be a realist. It's temporary. We have to put our faith in something that's going to last. And we have the opportunity to put our faith in a better king, one who never lets go, one who cannot be turned to the side, one that cannot be undermined, one who knows all, sees all, and has our good in mind. And I want to tell you this as we wrap up our time together today. Following Jesus, it isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. You hear me? Following Jesus is not always easy. It's not always easy to finish a race. That's why not everyone does it. That's why most people don't do it. That's why it's impressive to watch those who are willing to endure. It's not always easy, but it is always worth it. You say, but man, it's hard. It's hard sacrificing my time, saying no to the things that I want to do, disciplining myself to be part of his kingdom and not a part of the kingdom that just fleshly draws me and pulls me. I know. But it's worth it. But it's worth it. I have yet to meet the individual. And listen, I have these conversations more often than I wish I did. I have not met the individual who at the end of their life says, wow, I wish I wouldn't have followed Jesus as closely. I haven't met him. Now, I can tell you people who they committed their lives to Jesus, and they were godly men and godly women, and they loved the Lord, and they did all, they just admire their faith. And they say, wow, I wish I could have done more. I wish I would have followed closer. I wish I would have given my life to Jesus sooner. But man, I've never heard someone say, I followed Jesus too closely. I followed Jesus too close. No. Why? Because it's not always easy, but it is always worth it. And today, we have a number of different people in the room. We're coming from different backgrounds, different places, different understandings. But really, we have people in this room today. We have those who have placed their faith in Jesus Christ. What are you following after? Are you continuing to pursue that? Are you continuing to run the race? Are you getting sidetracked by all the distractions? Are you getting tired and saying, oh, I don't know how much further I can go on? So you want to say, continue. Keep running. We're here. We want to help you be able to endure and cross that finish line. And some of you, your life of faith, you haven't even begun the race. You've never put your faith in Jesus Christ. You're still counting on your good works. So you're saying, well, listen, I go to church and the church accepts me and likes me. Well, listen, it's not about what the church thinks. It's about what Jesus Christ knows. And so the truth is that until we place our faith in Jesus Christ alone for our salvation, that race has not even been started yet, spiritually speaking. And so where are you at?